Julie Usher. Welcome back. As promised, in this video I'm going to show you how to stencil around cookies that have windows, because that represents a little bit more challenge than just stenciling on a plain flat cookie. I have a whole video about doing that. When I mean a cookie with a window, I mean a cookie with a cutout in the center, like these that formed the tops of my Fabergé eggs, which we saw in an earlier video. What I want to do is basically show you how did I get this ornate purple pattern onto this cookie, and we're going to do it on the smaller version today. So I'm going to start by stenciling with purple, and then as time permits we'll also do some finish work with the dots. The stenciling goes down first in this particular application because I like to conceal any rough edges of the stenciling with the final dots or borders that I put on the cookie. And the undercoat needs to be completely dry because you're applying some pressure to it, and it's good to work on a non-skid surface. I have some shelf liner here because if the cookie moves while you're stenciling, you know, that will create a blurred stencil. So I basically want to plant purple here, purple here, purple here, and purple there with this scrolly pattern. And I did that with, actually, this was a big cake stencil, which I cut in half. So you don't have to work with cookie stencils per se. You can take larger ones and cut them down to a manageable size. And obviously, you know, this is covering much more of the cookie than I actually used. So to get the pattern on just the edges, what I do is I mask off portions of the stencil, and I mask off with this blue painter's tape. I mask off so that any icing, as I spread it over, it doesn't overflow either onto other parts of the cookie or deposit too much on the edge. If you don't mask it, you'll get a lot of overflow. And again, the key thing with stenciling is to have your icing at the right consistency, which is stenciling consistency, and I have all my consistency adjustments on the site. It's relatively thick. It clings to the back of an offset spatula, like so, and you don't need much. The other key thing is to keep that stencil lying flat and in position as you put the icing on it. So I am going to need to anchor this with my hand. I start by just dabbing a little bit down so that this, you know, if I don't do a big full swipe at first because that can move the stencil. My icing's always covered with plastic because it dries out quickly, particularly when it's this thick. So I keep it covered with plastic till the moment I use it. So I'm just getting coverage on all the areas first. Okay, I'm going to move my hand carefully, clean off the back side of the spatula, and do one final swipe to get all the track marks off. One or two swipes. I like to get this smoothed down to the level of the stencil. That looks pretty good. So even with masking off the stencil, there tends to be some icing that creeps underneath. You really do want to get that off before it dries into place because that'll interfere with putting those dots down later. So I'm knocking it with my trussing needle. Just removing that excess. It kind of neatens it up too, cleans up the border. So I'm going to repeat this process now 3 more times. I do opposing ends first because I want, if I were to stick this stencil up right next against this one I just did, I would smudge that. So I want to allow that some drying time. Just to show you how I mask, it's actually going to fit the cookie nicely. So I don't really love that end of the stencil because I don't see much scrolly pattern. So I'm shifting it up just to the point where these loops are sitting nicely on the sides of what is going to be this Fabergé egg. And then I'm going to block off that area that's going into the window so I don't get a lot of overflow in there. And I'm going to block off these edges. Probably need 3 pieces of tape down here just to get around the curve. I do this on the cookie, but I'm not taping to the cookie. You don't want to tape to the cookie because then you're not going to be able to lift the stencil off in the end. In the meantime, while I'm doing this, I'd probably sit this in the water in the sink. That'll lift up the blue painter's tape without having to peel it off, because if you peel it off, it can pull up pieces of the stencil and damage the stencil, but it'll soften it enough and it'll lift off without damaging the stencil. Clean it, pat it dry, flat between paper towels so it's ready to go for the other 2 sides. I'll come back and do that in a bit. Before I start stenciling afresh, I always clean off my spatula because that dry stuff will make it hard to spread the next amount of icing on top. It's lying flat. By virtue of where I've put my hands, I've gotten it to lie flat, and I'm just repeating exactly the same process I did before. Okay, nice and smooth. Rolling the stencil off. Got a big blob down here. Again, I'm just going to knock that off. And that might have been an indication of where I didn't tape close enough to the edge, but it's no big deal because you can't get that off. Okay, I'm going to go clean off these two stencils. Give this some time to dry, and then we'll finish it off with some simple beadwork. Okay, we're back. I've allowed just enough drying time so that these stencils are dry to the touch. I've already masked this off the way I did before, so I'm just going to plant it down. In this case, it's sometimes harder to get this stencil lying flat because the stencil underneath it is lifting up the stencil. So I'm anchoring it from both sides and just going through the same stenciling process I did before. Oops, that looks pretty good. I overmasked. This is an example of that. So I've got a lot of edge showing there. That's fine. That's why I put the borders on last, because I can come up really high and cover some of that, or at least make it less obvious that there's such a gap there. That's the essentials of how you mask off a stencil and stencil around a window. I'm just going to continue now with my beadwork icing, which is relatively loose. I've got a blue here. I think I'm going to start close to this side because I know that border needs to be filled, and it's best to get that right before I go all the way around and find out that I can't connect with it. So I'm just applying a little bit of pressure, pulling up, and because the icing's at exactly the right consistency, it'll form a bead on its own. Okay, the outer ring is done. We're going to come back in. I'm just going to finish off. I'm going to put a couple little dots blue on the stencil too. You don't have to wait too long for the underlying stenciling icing to dry if you're putting dark colors on dark colors, and also because that icing, the purple icing is relatively thick, it dries very, very quickly, so there's very little chance of bleeding. Ta-da! And that completes the frame for my Fabergé egg cookie and gives you the basics of how to stencil around a windowed cookie. In another video, I'll show you how to put this frame together with a bunch of other pieces to create my 3D Fabergé egg. Till then, live sweetly.